The weight of a promise can crush a man long before any bullet ever finds him. Sarah Bennett learned this truth twice in her life. First in the sterile halls of Fort Sam Houston when she was 22, and believed the world could be saved with clean hands. And again at 28 in the dust and fire of the Hindu Kush, when those same hands would be forced to choose between healing and killing, between the oath she swore and the lives she loved. But we begin where all soldiers begin, at the moment of transformation, at the crossing of a threshold that can never be uncrossed. Fort Sam Houston burned white hot under the Texas sun in the summer of 2005. Inside the medical training facility, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against August, and 73 young men and women stood at attention in dress uniforms that smelled of starch and new beginnings. Sarah Bennett stood in the third row, 5'6" with sandy blonde hair pulled tight in a regulation bun, her father's dog tags hidden beneath her uniform jacket, the metal pressed against her skin. Cold despite the heat, heavy despite weighing barely an ounce, the presiding colonel, a veteran with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many body bags, raised his right hand. The room fell silent except for the whisper of the air vents and the distant sound of a drill sergeant barking orders somewhere on the parade ground outside. "Repeat after me," the colonel said. His voice carried the weight of 30 years in uniform. "I solemnly pledge myself before God and in the presence of this assembly." 73 voices echoed the words. Sarah's voice caught for just a moment on the word solemnly. She thought of her father, Sergeant First Class David Bennett, dead 4 months now from complications related to Agent Orange exposure. A slow death, the kind that gives you time to say goodbye and regret and make promises to daughters who still believe in heroes. To pass my life in purity and to practice my profession faithfully. Sarah remembered her father's hospital room at the VA, the beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic trying and failing to mask the scent of decay. He had held her hand with fingers that trembled from neuropathy and said, "Baby girl, you got a gift. You can see hurt in people and you want to fix it. That's rare. That matters. I will abstain from whatever is deleterious and mischievous." Her father's voice had been barely a whisper by then. "Promise me something, Sarah. Promise me you'll use those hands to heal. Only to heal. Don't let them turn you into something else. The military will try, war will try, but you remember who you are. I will do all in my power to maintain and elevate the standard of my profession." She had promised. Of course she had promised. What daughter wouldn't promise a dying father anything he asked? First, do no harm. The ceremony ended. Young medics hugged and took photographs and talked about their first postings with the nervous excitement of people who don't yet understand what they've signed up for. Sarah stood apart, one hand unconsciously touching the dog tags beneath her uniform. Sergeant First Class David Bennett, blood type O positive, Protestant, born 1955, died 2005 with his daughter's promise ringing in his ears that she would never become what war had made him. The memory dissolved like smoke. 8 years evaporated in the space of a heartbeat, and suddenly Sarah was 28, standing in a different heat under a different sun, and the weight of that promise had grown heavier than any combat load she'd ever carried. The Hindu Kush rose like broken teeth against the pre-dawn sky. Sarah Bennett checked her aid bag for the 100th time in the staging area of Forward Operating Base Courage. Tourniquets, combat gauze, chest seals, morphine auto-injectors, Israeli bandages, quick clot, the familiar ritual of checking and rechecking. Making sure everything was where her hands could find it in the dark or under fire, or when someone's blood was spraying hot across her face. 6 years of combat deployments had taught her that preparation was the only prayer that mattered. Iraq in 2008 had been urban warfare. Close quarters, IEDs hidden in garbage piles and market stalls. She'd lost her first patient there. Private Danny Martinez, 19 years old from El Paso with a girlfriend back home and a letter in his pocket he'd never gotten to mail. Femoral artery severed by shrapnel. She'd pressed down with both hands, trying to stop the bleeding that wouldn't stop, and his eyes had found hers and held on like she was the last solid thing in a world that was spinning away from him. Then the light went out, just like that. One moment a person, the next moment gone. She'd thrown up afterwards in an alley while gunfire echoed 3 blocks over. Sergeant Martinez, a grizzled combat veteran with 2 tours already behind him, had found her there. "First one's always the worst," he'd said, not unkindly. "But it won't be your last. You got to make peace with that." She never had made peace with it. Instead, she'd gotten better, faster, more skilled at reading wounds and calculating odds and fighting death to a draw when she couldn't beat it outright. Afghanistan in 2010 had been mountains and ambushes and endless walking through terrain that tried to kill you just by existing. She'd saved 37 soldiers in that deployment. She knew the number because she kept a list, names and faces and what she'd done to keep them breathing long enough for the medevac birds to arrive. But she'd also saved one enemy fighter. His name was Khalid, early 20s, took 3 rounds to the chest during a firefight in Helmand province. His squad had fled and left him bleeding out in a poppy field. Sarah's platoon found him while doing a sweep. The lieutenant had walked over, looked down at the wounded Taliban fighter, and said, "Leave him." Sarah had looked at the young man's face, fear and pain and the certain knowledge of death. She'd knelt beside him anyway. "What are you doing, Bennett?" the lieutenant had asked. "My job, sir," she'd replied, and started cutting away the man's bloody tunic to access the wounds. Khalid had survived. Against odds, against common sense, against every argument that saving an enemy combatant was a waste of resources. He'd been evacuated to Bagram and eventually traded in a prisoner exchange. Sarah never knew what happened to him after that, but 3 months later, her platoon received intelligence that prevented an ambush. The source was a Taliban fighter who'd switched sides, who'd said an American medic had shown him that maybe not all Americans were demons. Whether it was Khalid or someone else, Sarah never knew. But the intelligence saved 40 lives that day. Her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had clapped her on the shoulder. "See, sometimes doing the right thing pays off tactically, too." But Sarah hadn't done it for tactics. She'd done it because a dying father had made her promise to heal. Only to heal, and she'd meant to keep that promise. Until the promise became impossible. Now in 2013, preparing for her 5th deployment, Sarah stood in the Afghan dawn and wondered if she still believed in anything at all. The optimistic girl who'd sworn the oath at Fort Sam Houston felt like someone from a different lifetime. That girl had thought healing was simple. You stop the bleeding, you stabilize the patient, you saved lives, clean hands, and clear conscience from harm. But combat had taught her that nothing was simple. Every life saved meant choosing not to save someone else. Every minute spent on one wounded soldier was a minute not spent on another. Triage wasn't medicine. It was playing God with a stopwatch. "Sarah, you ready?" She turned. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Harper stood in the doorway of the briefing room. 35 years old, 6'2", former Ranger with eyes the color of storm clouds and a purple heart he never talked about. He'd been serving in Iraq at the same time as her father, had known David Bennett, had been there the day an IED turned Sergeant Bennett's Humvee into scrap metal and sent him home with internal injuries that would take 5 more years to kill him. When Sarah had been assigned to Harper's unit 6 months ago, he'd taken one look at her name and gone still. "Bennett," he'd said quietly. "Any relation to David Bennett?" She'd swallowed hard. "My father, sir." Something had shifted in Harper's expression then. Grief and guilt and a promise made to a dying man in a hospital bed half a world away. "I knew him. Good soldier. Better man. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you, sir." And then, so quiet she almost missed it. "I promised him I'd look out for you if our paths ever crossed. Didn't expect them to, but I keep my promises." Since then, Harper had been more than a commanding officer. He'd been a mentor, a father figure in a world where fathers seemed to die and leave daughters to figure out how to be soldiers on their own. He knew every soldier's name in his company, knew their families, their fears, their reasons for serving. He led from the front, never asked his people to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Sarah respected him more than anyone she'd served with, which made what was about to happen so much worse. "Ready as I'll be, sir," she said, shouldering her aid bag. Harper studied her for a moment. Something in his eyes suggested he knew, that he could see the weight she carried, the promise she'd made, the doubt that aided her in the hours before dawn. "You carrying your father's tags?" he asked. Her hand went automatically to her chest, where the dog tags rested against her skin. "Always, sir." Harper nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own set of tags. But these weren't his. She recognized the stamped metal, the familiar numbers. "Those are your father's," Harper confirmed. "He gave them to me the day before he died. Made me promise I'd give them to you when you needed them most. I've been carrying them for 4 years, Bennett, waiting for the right moment." He held them out. Sarah took them with hands that trembled. Why now, she asked. Because where we're going today, Harper said quietly, you're going to need to remember who you are and who you're fighting to protect. Those tags, they're a reminder that the best soldiers are the ones who never forget what they're really protecting. Not ground, not objectives. People. The ones who trust us to bring them home. Sarah closed her fingers around the tags. They felt heavier than they should, heavier than physics allowed. Your father told me something before he died, Harper continued. He said you'd promised him you'd never pick up a rifle in anger, that you'd be a healer, not a killer. Sarah's throat tightened. Yes, sir. Harper met her eyes. That's a good promise, Bennett. An honorable promise. But I need you to understand something. Sometimes the only way to protect life is to take it. Sometimes healing means stopping the harm at its source. If that day comes, if that choice has to be made, I need to know you'll do what's necessary, not just what's right. Can you do that? The question hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Sarah thought about her father in his hospital bed, thought about the oath she'd sworn, thought about the M4 rifle locked in the armory with her name on it, barely touched except for mandatory qualification ranges. She joined the Army as a medic because medics didn't have to kill. They saved. It was clean, simple. But nothing stayed simple in war. I don't know, sir, she said honestly. I've never had to make that choice. Harper's expression softened. If you're lucky, you never will. But if you're not, he paused. Just remember, keeping your promise to your father isn't just about keeping your hands clean. It's about making sure his daughter survives long enough to honor him with a life well lived. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, Bennett. Whatever happens today, whatever choices you make, I want you to know I'm proud to serve with you. Your father would be too. Then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with 2 sets of dog tags and a weight that had nothing to do with metal. The briefing room filled slowly. 12 soldiers, Alpha Squad of Charlie Company, each one a person, a story, a reason for being in this godforsaken corner of the world. Specialist Rebecca Pixel Chen sat near the front, pulling a photograph from her helmet's webbing. A little girl, 4 years old with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Chen was a single mother. The father had disappeared when he found out about the baby. She joined the Army for the steady paycheck and health insurance, and now she was on her 3rd deployment, counting days until she could go home and read bedtime stories again. Corporal Nathan Silva took point position. 29 years old, 5 months left on his enlistment. He had a business plan saved on a thumb drive in his pocket, a motorcycle repair shop in Tucson. He'd already put a down payment on a property, already had a name picked out, Silva's Custom Cycles. After this deployment, he was done. No more wars, just engines and chrome and customers who didn't shoot at you. Private First Class Carl Mitchell sat in the back, 19 years old and trying to look older. This was his first deployment. His mother had cried at the airport when he left, had pressed a letter into his hands. Don't open it unless you really need it, she'd said, but know that I'm proud of you. Mitchell had that letter in his chest pocket now, folded and refolded so many times the creases were starting to tear. Sergeant Marcus Bear Thompson checked his weapon with the calm efficiency of a man who'd done this too many times to count. 32 years old, weapons specialist, 2 kids at home, and a wife who sent care packages filled with homemade cookies and photographs of Little League games he was missing. Thompson had a countdown app on his phone, 147 days until he could be a father again instead of a soldier. Corporal David Reyes sat with a laptop balanced on his knees, monitoring communications. 27 years old, talented engineer who could have made 6 figures in Silicon Valley, but chose to serve instead. His little sister was getting married in 6 months. He was supposed to walk her down the aisle, had already rented the tux, already written his speech about how she'd always been the brave one in the family and how honored he was to give her away. The others filed in, each carrying their own weights, their own reasons, their own tomorrows they were fighting to reach. Harper entered last, and everyone came to attention. At ease, he said. Gather round. They crowded around the table where a satellite image showed a compound deep in Kunar province. Remote, mountainous. The kind of terrain where helicopters struggled with the thin air and soldiers learned that every step could be their last. Intelligence indicates a Taliban weapons cache here, Harper began, pointing to the largest building. Small security force, maybe 3 to 5 fighters. We go in at 0400, hard and fast. Secure the cache, extract any useful intelligence. Out before sunrise. Seems too easy, Silva murmured. It won't be easy, Harper replied. Nothing in the Kush is easy, but intel is solid. Overwatch will be on the ridge providing cover. Air support on standby. We stick to the plan, we'll be back for breakfast. He looked around at his team, his people. Sarah saw something in his eyes then, a flicker of doubt, a soldier's intuition that whispered warnings no intelligence report could capture. Questions? Harper asked. Reyes raised a hand. Exfil plan if things go sideways? 2 rally points. Primary is the North Ridge. Secondary is the valley floor 1 click east. Medevac can reach either in under 10 minutes if we need them. Harper's eyes found Sarah. Bennett, you'll stay tight on me. If anyone goes down, I want you close enough to respond immediately. Yes, sir. The briefing ended. Soldiers dispersed to final preparations. Checking gear, writing letters they hoped they'd never need to send, making peace with whatever cause or luck or fate they believed in. Sarah found herself in the corner of the staging area, staring at her aid bag. Everything was ready. Everything was always ready. She could treat gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, broken bones, sucking chest wounds, traumatic amputations. She could keep someone alive through injuries that should have killed them. She was good at her job. Better than good. But she'd never fired her weapon at another human being. The M4 rifle leaned against the wall beside her aid bag. Standard issue, cleaned and maintained and qualified on, but it felt foreign in a way her medical equipment never did. The aid bag was an extension of her hands. The rifle was something else, something that required a transformation she wasn't sure she could make. Sarah, she turned. Harper stood there, his own rifle slung across his chest with the easy familiarity of a man who'd been carrying weapons since he was 18. You good, he asked. She wanted to say yes, wanted to be the soldier he needed her to be, but something about the way he looked at her, with understanding that came from knowing her father, from carrying the promise of a dying man, made lying impossible. I keep thinking about something my dad said, she admitted, right before he died. He told me war would try to change who I was, that it would try to turn me into something else. Harper was quiet for a moment. Then he said, your father was right, war does change people. But here's what he might not have told you because he didn't want to scare you. Sometimes that change is necessary. Sometimes the person you were before isn't strong enough to protect the people you love. That sounds like an excuse. Maybe, or maybe it's just the truth. He met her eyes. I knew your father in Iraq. Saw him make impossible choices. Saw him carry the weight of those choices for years. And you know what I learned? The soldiers who break are the ones who convince themselves they had to enjoy it. That killing was easy, that it didn't cost them anything. Your father never convinced himself of that. He knew the price and he paid it and he hated every penny. But he paid it anyway because the alternative was letting his soldiers die. Sarah looked down at the dog tags in her hand, her father's name stamped in metal that would outlast flesh and bone and memory. Did he ever tell you what he wished he'd done differently, she asked. Harper nodded slowly. Once we were in a hospital. He was recovering from that IED blast. I asked him if he had any regrets. You know what he said? What? He said his only regret was that his daughter would have to learn the same hard lessons he did. That she'd have to choose between keeping her hands clean and keeping her people alive. And he said he hoped when that day came, she'd be strong enough to choose the harder path. Sarah felt her chest tighten. That's not fair, making it sound noble when it's just necessary? Harper finished. Yeah, that's the word that keeps soldiers up at night. Not honor, not duty, necessary. Because when it's necessary, you don't get to feel good about it. You just have to do it and live with it and hope that the people you saved were worth what you had to become. He started to walk away, then paused. Oh, 400 is in 90 minutes, he said. Get some rest. Or don't, but be ready. Sarah didn't rest. Instead, she sat with the other members of Alpha Squad in a corner of the FOB where someone had dragged out a crate to use as a makeshift table. Silva had produced a deck of cards from somewhere. Poker. The universal language of soldiers with too much time and too many thoughts. We playing for money or pride, Chen asked. Neither, Thompson rumbled. We're playing for keeps. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. His 2 kids on a swing set, smiling like the world was good and fathers always came home. We each put in the thing that matters most, Thompson continued. Winner holds on to everything until we all get back. Then we know we made it. All of us. The idea spread like wildfire. Chen added the photograph of her daughter. Silva produced the thumb drive with his business plan. Mitchell reluctantly surrendered the letter from his mother. Reyes offered his little sister's wedding invitation. One by one, the soldiers of Alpha Squad placed their precious things on the crate table. Photographs and letters, and dog tags and dreams folded into paper and plastic. Sarah looked at her father's tags, the ones Harper had given her. The weight of a promise and a life in expectations she wasn't sure she could meet. She placed them on the pile. Harper was the last to approach. He looked at the collection of precious things, these fragments of lives lived outside the wire, and something in his expression cracked open just enough to show the human beneath the officer. "You're betting I can keep you alive?" he asked softly. "We're betting you'll try," Silva said. Harper pulled his wallet from his pocket. From it, he extracted a small photograph. Edges worn from years of handling. A woman with kind eyes and a baby in her arms. "My wife," Harper said quietly, "and my daughter took this picture 3 months before the divorce. Before I chose the Army over marriage. Before I became the kind of man who's better at leading soldiers than being a husband." He placed it on the pile with the others. "I'll keep these safe," he said, "and I'll keep all of you safe. That's a promise. Not to the Army, not to the mission. To each of you as people I'd be proud to call family." The poker game that followed was subdued. Half-hearted bets and jokes that didn't quite land. Everyone was thinking about the pile of precious things in the center of the table. About what it meant to put your whole life into someone else's hands. Harper won. Of course he did. He always won at poker because he could read people the way Sarah could read wounds. Looking for tells, for weaknesses, for the thing beneath the surface that revealed the truth. He gathered the photographs and letters and tags and dreams into his cargo pocket, with the reverence of a priest handling holy relics. "Safe as houses," he promised. "When we get back, we'll have a drink and sort this out properly." "If we get back," Mitchell said, then caught himself. "Sorry, when we get back." But the word "if" hung in the air like smoke. The pre-dawn darkness was absolute. No moon, no stars. Just the weight of the mountains pressing down and the whisper of boots on stone as Alpha Squad moved through the valley in single file. Silva walked point, his rifle up and ready. Harper was third in line. Sarah stayed close behind him, exactly as ordered, her aid bag bouncing against her back with each step. The Hindu Kush was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Sharp peaks against the sky just beginning to lighten from black to charcoal. The air was thin and cold and smelled of dust and distance. Sarah's breath came quick and shallow, partly from the altitude and partly from the knowledge that every step took them deeper into terrain where help was measured in minutes they might not have. "Overwatch team, this is Alpha 1, Harper whispered into his radio. "Status? Alpha 1, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on target. Thermal shows 2, maybe 3 heat signatures. Main building, no movement outside." "Copy that," Harper replied, moving to phase line Alpha. They advanced, slow and careful, every sound magnified in the darkness. The scrape of boot on rock, the metallic click of a rifle being shifted, the rasp of breathing through airways that labored in the thin mountain air. Sarah's hand went unconsciously to the dog tags around her neck. Both sets now, hers and her father's. The weight was immense. Or perhaps that was just fear and adrenaline and the knowledge that she was walking toward violence with hands trained to heal. The compound emerged from the darkness like a predator waiting in ambush. Low mud brick buildings clustered together behind crumbling walls, exactly as the satellite imagery had shown, exactly as intelligence had described. "Too quiet," Silva murmured over comms. Harper raised his fist. The column froze. "Overwatch, talk to me," Harper whispered. "What do you see?" "Negative movement, Alpha 1. Thermal still shows 2 to 3 signatures. But what?" The Overwatch spotter's voice carried a thread of concern. "Something doesn't feel right, sir. Place is too buttoned up. Too still." Harper was silent for 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Sarah watched his shoulders rise and fall with controlled breathing, watched him process the information. "Weigh the risks. Make the call that commanders make." "We proceed," Harper finally said. "Fast insertion. Mitchell and Thompson, secure the perimeter. Everyone else? We're going in hard. Bennett stays on me." "Questions?" No one spoke. Silva set charges on the gate while the others took positions. Sarah checked her aid bag one final time. Tourniquet within easy reach. Combat gauze. Hemostatic agents. Chest seals. Morphine. Everything exactly where it needed to be. She looked at Harper's back. broad shoulders carrying the weight of 12 lives, carrying the promise he'd made to her father, carrying the photographs and letters and dreams of people who trusted him to bring them home. Breaching in three, Silva said. Sarah's hand found the grip of her M4. The rifle felt wrong, foreign, like holding someone else's limb. 2. She thought about the oath. First, do no harm. 1. The gate exploded inward, and Alpha Squad poured into the compound, and Sarah crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed, and the world erupted in fire and chaos, and the screaming started, and somewhere in the ringing aftermath of the blast, she heard Harper's voice steady and calm, giving orders, and she moved forward because that's what soldiers do. And she had no idea that in 47 minutes she would be kneeling in blood and dust holding a rifle instead of a bandage, and choosing between the woman she'd promised to be and the soldier she had to become. But that would come later. For now, in the last seconds before everything changed, Sarah Bennett was still a medic who believed in clean hands and clear conscience and promises made to dying fathers. In the last seconds before the world caught fire, she still believed healing was enough. Then the Taliban opened fire from every window and doorway, and the compound became a killing field. And Alpha Squad learned what every soldier eventually learns. That intelligence is sometimes wrong. That plans fall apart on contact. That the only promise war keeps is that someone is going to bleed. And that the choice between healing and killing isn't always a choice at all. Sometimes it's just survival. The first bullet caught Private Kyle Mitchell in the chest with a sound like a hammer striking meat. His body armor absorbed the impact, but the force spun him sideways into the mud brick wall. The second bullet found the gap between his collar and helmet. Blood sprayed in an arc that caught the first light of dawn and turned it crimson. Sarah Bennett was moving before Mitchell hit the ground. 6 years of combat deployments had turned her into something that operated on instinct when thought was too slow. Her aid bag was already sliding off her shoulder as she crossed the 10 feet of open ground that separated healing from death. Bullets cracked past her head close enough that she felt the heat of their passage. An RPG shrieked overhead and detonated against the compound wall, showering her with fragments of ancient brick that stung like hornets. She slid beside Mitchell on her knees. His eyes were wide-eyed and rolling with panic. Blood pulsed from his neck in rhythmic spurts that told her the carotid artery was compromised. Not severed. If it had been severed, he would already be dead. But grazed, torn. 30 seconds until unconsciousness. 90 seconds until irreversible brain damage. 2 minutes until she would be closing his eyes instead of saving his life. "Stay with me, Kyle," she said. Her voice was steady despite the chaos erupting around them, despite the fact that automatic weapons fire was tearing the morning air into strips of sound and fury. "You're going to be fine, just a scratch." It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie, but lies told with conviction could keep a dying man conscious long enough to be saved. And consciousness was the difference between a patient and a corpse. Her hands worked with the precision of a surgeon and the speed of a pit crew. Combat gauze from her aid bag, the special kind impregnated with hemostatic agents that would promote clotting. She packed it into the wound with pressure that made Mitchell grunt in pain. Pain was good. Pain meant alive. Pain meant nerve endings still firing, and a heart still pumping, and a brain still processing signals from a body that wanted desperately to survive. Around her, Alpha Squad was discovering that intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The compound was not defended by 3 fighters. It was defended by 30. Maybe more. Taliban militants were firing from every window, every doorway, every prepared position. This was not a weapons cache lightly guarded. This was a fortress, a trap, a killing ground designed to lure American soldiers into an ambush where their training and equipment and courage would mean nothing against overwhelming numbers and prepared defenses. "Man down," someone screamed into the radio. "Multiple casualties. Request immediate QRF." Negative on QRF, came the reply from Battalion Command. "All units engaged. You are alone. Hold position and wait for air support." "How long?" Lieutenant Colonel Harper's voice cut through the chaos with the calm of a man who had lived through worse and knew that panic killed faster than bullets. 30 minutes, came the reply. Maybe more. Weather is deteriorating. Birds might not be able to fly. 30 minutes in a firefight like this was an eternity measured in heartbeats and ammunition counts, and the mathematics of survival that never added up the way you needed them to. Sarah finished packing Mitchell's wound and jabbed a morphine auto-injector into his thigh. The drug would dull the pain and slow his breathing and buy her precious seconds to move him to cover. She gripped him under the arms and began dragging him backward toward the main building where the rest of Alpha Squad was trying to establish a defensive perimeter. Specialist Rebecca Chen appeared beside her. Pixel, the single mother with a 4-year-old daughter waiting at home. Chen's face was streaked with dust and sweat, and her eyes held the bright intensity of a person running on pure adrenaline. "I got him," Chen said, taking Mitchell's other arm. Together, they hauled the wounded private across ground that erupted with bullet strikes like a field being plowed by invisible hands. They made it to the building. Barely. A bullet clipped Sarah's shoulder strap and sent her aid bag spinning. She grabbed it with one hand while keeping her grip on Mitchell with the other. They crashed through the doorway into chaos. The main building was filled with smoke and dust and wounded men. Sergeant Marcus Thompson was bleeding from shrapnel cuts across his face and arm, deep gouges that would scar but would not kill. Private David Reyes was shouting into his radio for close air support that was not coming. Corporal Nathan Silva was firing controlled bursts from a window while blood ran down his leg from a wound he either had not noticed or was ignoring. Sarah's training took over. The part of her brain that could shut out fear and focus entirely on triage. Who needed treatment first? Who could wait? Who was beyond saving and had to be marked for the chaplain instead of the surgeon? Mitchell went against the wall, stable for now, but needing evacuation soon. Thompson got pressure bandages and assurances that facial wounds always bled worse than they were. Silva got a tourniquet cinched high on his thigh and a sharp order to stop firing and sit down before he bled out standing up. "Bennett," Harper's voice cut through the noise. He was at the window firing precise 3-round bursts at targets Sarah could not see. "We need to fall back to a better position. This building is compromised." "Where?" Sarah asked. Her hands were already bloody. Mitchell's blood, Thompson's blood, Silva's blood, all the same color, all equally precious. "Storage room at the back," Harper said. "Better walls, single entry point we can defend." He turned to give the order, and that was when the IED detonated. The Taliban had been planning this ambush for weeks, had prepared the battlefield with the patience of men who understood that war was not about courage or honor, but about killing your enemy in the most efficient way possible. They had buried an improvised explosive device beneath the floor of the main room, had waited for the Americans to gather in one place, had triggered it at the perfect moment when retreat was cut off and advance was impossible, and the only option was to die together in a room that became a tomb. The explosion lifted Sarah off her feet and threw her against the wall with force that cracked ribs and drove the air from her lungs. The world became white light and deafening noise, and then absolute silence broken only by a high-pitched ringing that would not stop. She hit the ground hard. Her helmet saved her skull, but her head rang like a bell and her vision swam with dark spots that might have been unconsciousness trying to pull her under. She fought it, pushed herself up on hands that shook, coughed dust from lungs that did not want to inflate, looked around at devastation. The roof had partially collapsed. Daylight stabbed through holes torn in mud brick that had stood for a century before being destroyed in a second. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, some moving, some not. Dust hung in the air so thick it was like breathing concrete. Sarah's training screamed at her to start triage, to assess casualties, to save who could be saved. But her eyes found Harper first and everything else became secondary. He was down, 20 feet away. His right leg twisted at an angle that legs should not twist. Blood pooling beneath him in a spreading stain that was too large and too fast and spoke of arterial damage that would kill him in minutes. "Sir?" Sarah croaked. Her voice sounded distant and strange, muffled by the ringing in her ears and the dust in her throat. Harper's eyes found hers. He was still conscious, still aware. His right hand was pressed against his thigh, trying to stop bleeding that would not stop. His left hand still gripped his M4 rifle with the instinct of a soldier who had been carrying weapons for so long that even dying he would not let go. Sarah crawled toward him. Her ribs screamed with each movement. Something was broken inside her, but she could not afford to care about her own injuries when Harper was bleeding out in front of her. She reached him, and her hands went immediately to his leg. Femoral artery, the big one. The kind of bleed that emptied a human body in under 5 minutes. She ripped open her last tourniquet, the bright orange strap that was the difference between life and death, snaked it high on his thigh, as high as it would go, began cranking the windlass with strength born from desperation. The bleeding slowed but did not stop. She cranked harder, harder, until Harper grunted in pain and the bleeding finally reduced to a manageable seep. But there were other wounds: shrapnel to his abdomen, the telltale sucking sound of a punctured lung, internal injuries that were beyond her ability to treat in a combat zone. He needed a surgeon. He needed a hospital. He needed things that were 30 minutes away by helicopter, and 30 minutes was forever when you were bleeding into your own chest cavity. "The squad," Harper whispered. Blood bubbled at his lips. Another bad sign. Internal bleeding finding its way into airways that should be clear. "Get them out." Sarah looked around. The explosion had scattered Alpha Squad like leaves in a storm. Silva was unconscious. Thompson was trapped under debris, struggling to free himself. Chen was firing from a window with mechanical precision, despite blood running down her face from a scalp wound that made her look like a horror movie victim. Reyes was still at his radio, still calling for support that was not coming. And then she heard the voices outside. Taliban fighters, shouting in Pashto, triumphant, smelling victory. They would be coming through the walls any second now, coming to finish what the IED had started. "Not without you, sir," Sarah said to Harper. She slid her hands under his arms and began dragging him toward the back of the building, toward the storage room where walls might be thicker and defense might be possible. Harper weighed over 200 pounds with gear. Every inch she dragged him felt like a mile. Bullets cracked through the windows. An RPG slammed into the wall behind them and showered them with debris. Harper tried to help, pushing with his good leg, but he was weakening, fading, losing too much blood despite the tourniquet. They made it to the storage room, barely. Sarah propped him against the wall and ran another assessment. The tourniquet was holding, but his breathing was shallow and rapid. His face was the color of old paper. His eyes kept losing focus and finding it again, like a man fighting to stay conscious through sheer force of will. "Mara," Harper whispered. Then he caught himself. "Sarah, sorry, you remind me of someone." "Save your strength, sir," Sarah said. She was opening a chest seal to treat the punctured lung. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of 6 years treating combat trauma. But her mind was fracturing, splitting between the medic who knew how to treat wounds and the soldier who understood they were losing this fight. "No birds coming," Harper said. His voice was barely audible. Weather socked in. You know what that means. It meant they were alone. It meant no cavalry was riding to the rescue. It meant Alpha Squad would hold or die with no help and no hope, except what they could make for themselves. From the main room came Reyes's voice, desperate, frantic. "They are coming through the east wall. We cannot hold." Sarah looked at Harper's M4, still clutched in his hands even as consciousness slipped away from him. She looked at her own rifle leaning against the wall where she had dropped it when the IED went off. She had not fired it, not once, not in 6 years of deployments. She had qualified with it, had cleaned it, had carried it, but she had never aimed it at another human being with the intent to kill. "Mara," Harper said again, then clearer. "Sarah, take it. Take my rifle. The squad needs every shooter." "Sir, I am a medic," Sarah said. The words came automatically. The identity she had built her entire military career around. "I save lives. I do not take them." "Do not." "You are a soldier first," Harper said. His voice carried an edge of steel that cut through the weakness in his body. "Right now, those soldiers need a leader. Be that leader, Sarah." The firefight was getting closer. She could hear Taliban voices, could hear Chen screaming for more ammunition, could hear Thompson shouting that Silva was not breathing and needed CPR, and there was no one to do it because everyone was fighting or dying or both. Sarah Bennett knelt in the blood and dust and looked at her hands. These hands had saved lives. Dozens of lives. Maybe hundreds if you counted the cumulative effect of every soldier she had kept breathing long enough to reach proper medical care. These were healing hands, clean hands, hands that kept promises made to dying fathers. But her father's promise was becoming impossible to keep. She thought about the poker game, about the pile of precious things Harper was carrying in his cargo pocket. Chen's daughter, Silva's business plan, Mitchell's letter from his mother, Thompson's photographs of his kids, Reyes's wedding invitation, all the tomorrows these people were fighting to reach. All the lives waiting for them beyond this compound in this valley where the mountains pressed down and the Taliban closed in and helicopters could not fly through weather that had turned against them. Harper was watching her. Even dying, even barely conscious, he was watching with eyes that understood. that had seen her father make these same calculations, that had carried the weight of command long enough to know what he was asking her to do. "I will come back for you, sir," Sarah promised. She reached for his M4. "I know you will," Harper said. A weak smile touched his bloodless lips. "Now go. That is an order." Sarah took the rifle, checked the magazine, half full, pulled the remaining magazines from Harper's tactical vest, and stuffed them into her own pouches. The weapon felt foreign in her hands, heavier than it should be, weighted with more than steel and polymer. She stood, turned toward the door, took one step and stopped. "Sarah," Harper called weakly. She turned back. He was looking at her with absolute clarity despite the morphine and blood loss and dying. "You are just like your father." He would be proud. Then his eyes closed and his breathing became so shallow she could barely see his chest move. Sarah ran from the storage room into hell. The main chamber was chaos. Chen was at a window firing 3-round bursts with ammunition running critically low. Thompson had freed himself from the debris and was trying to perform CPR on Silva while simultaneously returning fire. Mitchell was conscious again, terror and morphine warring in his eyes. Reyes was screaming into his radio that they needed immediate extraction or they would all be dead in 10 minutes. Sarah took it all in with a single glance. The tactical part of her brain that had been trained at Fort Benning and honed through 4 combat deployments suddenly engaged in a way it never had before. She was not looking at this as a medic anymore. She was looking at it as a soldier, as a leader, as someone who had to make impossible choices because the alternative was letting everyone die. "Chen, ammunition status," Sarah barked. Her voice was different, harder, the voice of someone giving orders instead of taking them. "Last magazine," Chen called back without taking her eyes from her sights. "Thompson, Silva's status." "No pulse," Thompson said. His voice was ragged. "I cannot get him back." Sarah felt something inside her crack. Silva, the motorcycle mechanic with dreams of Tucson and chrome and a life after war. Gone. The first death she could have prevented if she had been fighting instead of healing. If she had picked up a rifle instead of a tourniquet. No, that was survivor's guilt talking. The IED had killed Silva. Not her choices, not her promise to her father. But the knowledge did not make it hurt any less. "Mark him and move on," Sarah ordered. She sounded like Harper now. Cold, clinical. The voice of command that put mission before mourning, because mourning could wait until everyone was safe and mission could not. Thompson hesitated only a moment. Then he dragged Silva's body to the wall and covered his face with a poncho. The gesture was small, but it mattered. It said Silva was still a person, still deserved dignity even in death. Sarah moved to the window beside Chen and looked out at the battlefield through Harper's optics. What she saw made her stomach drop. At least 20 Taliban fighters were massing for a final assault. They had spent the last 10 minutes softening up Alpha Squad with suppressing fire. Now they were preparing to overwhelm the position with sheer numbers. The mathematics were brutal. 5 soldiers left combat effective, maybe 30 rounds per person, against 20 attackers with unlimited ammunition in the high ground and the will of men who believed they were fighting for their homeland against invaders. Sarah's mind raced through options. Hold position and die slowly as ammunition ran out. Attempt to break out and die quickly in the open ground. Wait for rescue that was not coming. Or change the equation entirely. She remembered something Harper had taught her during a training exercise 6 months ago. They had been discussing asymmetric warfare. How to win when the enemy had more guns and more men and more will to die. When the math does not work, Harper had said, change the math. Find the advantage they do not expect. Hit them where they are not looking. Make them react to you instead of you reacting to them. Sarah closed her eyes, thought, calculated, and saw it. The weapons cache. Intelligence had said the compound contained a Taliban weapons stockpile. That was why Alpha Squad had come here in the first place, which meant somewhere in this compound was a building filled with ammunition and explosives and everything the Taliban needed to wage war against American forces. "Reyes," Sarah called. "Where exactly is the cache?" Reyes looked up from his radio with eyes that had seen too much death in too short a time. "Northeast corner, across the courtyard, 50 meters. Sarah looked at the courtyard. 50 meters of open ground. A killing field under direct observation from every Taliban position. Suicide to cross, certain death. Unless, "How much smoke do we have left?" Sarah asked. 2 grenades, Reyes said, and 1 thermite. Sarah made her decision, the kind of decision that would define the rest of her life or end it in the next 5 minutes. Chen, Thompson, when I say mark, you lay down everything you have left. I do not care about ammunition conservation. I want volume of fire. Make them think twice about showing their heads. What are you doing? Chen asked. But Sarah heard the understanding in her voice. Chen was smart. She could see where this was going. Getting us a fighting chance, Sarah said. She looked at Reyes. On my signal, you pop smoke between here and that cache building. Purple if you have it. I have purple, Reyes confirmed. Sarah checked Harper's M4 one more time, chambered around, clicked the fire selector to semi-automatic. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the certainty of what she was about to do, of the line she was about to cross. She thought about her father in his hospital bed, about the promise she had made, about clean hands and clear conscience, and the oath she had sworn 8 years ago in a ceremony that felt like it had happened to a different person. First, do no harm. But harm was already here. Harm was the Taliban fighters massing for an assault that would kill everyone she had sworn to protect. And stopping that harm required becoming something she had promised never to become. A killer. Mark, Sarah said. Reyes threw the smoke grenade. Purple smoke billowed across the courtyard. Chen and Thompson opened fire with everything they had left. The volume was incredible, deafening. It sounded like a platoon instead of 2 soldiers with a handful of ammunition. Sarah ran. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no physical sense. The 50 meters felt like 50 miles. Every step was measured in heartbeats, in breaths, in the calculations of trajectory and velocity that separated life from death by inches. Bullets snapped past her head. She heard them crack through the air with sounds like bullwhips. One round tugged at her sleeve. Another sparked off the ground so close that fragments of stone stung her ankle. The smoke was thick, but it was not solid. Shapes moved through it. Muzzle flashes. Shadows of men with guns tracking her movement. Sarah fired Harper's M4 from the hip. No time to aim, no time to think. Just point and shoot and keep moving. She had no idea if she hit anything. Did not have time to care. Her entire world narrowed to the building ahead and the ground beneath her feet, and the terrible certainty that any second a bullet would find her, and this desperate gamble would end with her bleeding out in the dust. She hit the door of the cache building at full speed, crashed through, rolled, came up with the rifle pointed at nothing because the room was empty except for crates. Crates of weapons, AK-47s stacked like cordwood, RPG-7s with rockets, boxes of ammunition, and in the corner blocks of C4 plastic explosive with detonators still attached. The Taliban had been planning something massive, an attack on a forward operating base maybe, or a vehicle convoy. Enough explosive here to level a building or destroy a dozen Humvees. Sarah worked fast, grabbed an RPG and slung it across her back. Stuffed magazines into every available pocket. Her aid bag was already full of medical supplies, but she crammed in more ammunition anyway until the weight threatened to drag her to her knees. Then she turned to the C4. She had seen enough IEDs disarmed to understand the basics. Detonator, timer, boom. The Taliban version was crude but effective. She set the timer for 3 minutes. Enough time to get back. Not enough time for anyone to disarm it. Her hands hesitated over the arming switch. Once she flipped this switch, she was committed. This was not defending herself. This was offense. Attack. Becoming the aggressor instead of the protector. This was breaking the promise. Sarah thought about Harper bleeding out in the storage room, about Silva dead under a poncho, about Chen's daughter who would grow up without a mother if Sarah failed here, about Thompson's kids, about Mitchell's mother waiting for a letter that might never come, about all the tomorrows that would never happen if she did not flip this switch. She flipped it. The timer began counting down. 3 minutes. 180 seconds. Enough time to regret everything or enough time to save everyone. Sarah grabbed as much ammunition as she could carry and ran back into the smoke. The return trip was worse than the approach. The smoke had thinned. Taliban fighters could see her now. A woman running across open ground burdened with equipment and ammunition. An easy target. A gift. They opened fire with everything. AK-47s on full automatic. RPGs that screamed past and detonated against the far wall. The noise was beyond deafening. It was apocalyptic. The sound of the world ending in fire and metal. Sarah felt a bullet hit her thigh. The impact spun her. She went down hard, skidded. The M4 flew from her hands. For a moment, she lay there stunned, waiting for the follow-up shots that would finish her. They did not come. Instead, she heard the sharp crack of precision fire. Harper's M9 pistol. She turned her head and saw him through the doorway of the main building, propped against the wall, so weak he could barely hold the weapon, but still fighting, still protecting his people with the last of his strength. The Taliban fighter who had shot Sarah fell. Harper had killed him with a pistol shot at 50 meters while bleeding to death. The kind of marksmanship that came from a lifetime of training and the absolute refusal to let his soldiers die. Sarah scrambled to her feet. Her thigh burned where the bullet had grazed her, but the wound was superficial, painful but not fatal. She scooped up the M4 and the scattered ammunition and ran the last 20 meters. She crashed through the doorway, and Chen grabbed her, pulled her into cover. How long on that timer? 90 seconds, Sarah gasped. Everyone down, Chen screamed. Danger close. The Taliban were advancing, emboldened by blood, by numbers, by the certain knowledge that the Americans were out of ammunition and out of options and out of time. Sarah lay on the ground next to Harper. He was barely conscious. His breathing was so shallow she could hardly see his chest move, but his eyes found hers and held. You came back, he whispered. I promise, Sarah said. Your father, Harper breathed, would be proud. Then his eyes closed, and Sarah could not tell if he was unconscious or dead, and there was no time to check because the C4 detonated. The explosion was massive, the entire weapons cache going up at once. The fireball climbed 100 feet into the Afghan sky, and the shockwave flattened everyone within 50 meters. The sound was beyond hearing. It was a physical force that crushed the air from lungs and turned the world into ringing silence. Sarah lay on the ground with her arms over her head and felt the debris rain down. Chunks of mud brick, pieces of weapons, things that might have been human remains, but she did not let herself think about that. When the dust settled and her ears stopped ringing enough to hear again, Sarah raised her head and looked out at devastation. The cache building was gone. Just a crater and flames. The Taliban assault had been obliterated. Bodies lay scattered across the courtyard. The survivors were fleeing, running back toward the mountains. The ambush had become a rout. Alpha Squad had won. At terrible cost, with impossible odds, but they had won. Sarah crawled to Harper, pressed 2 fingers against his neck, found a pulse, weak and thready, but there. Still alive, still fighting. She looked at her hands, covered in blood and dust and the residue of violence. The right hand that had fired a rifle, the left hand that had armed an explosive. Neither hand was clean anymore. Neither hand could claim innocence. But both hands had saved lives. Sarah pressed her forehead against Harper's chest and listened to his heartbeat and made a new promise. Not to her father this time, to herself. She would carry this weight, this burden of being both healer and killer. She would carry it because the alternative was letting good people die. And she would spend the rest of her life trying to make peace with what she had become. But that would come later. For now, there was only survival. Only the radio crackling to life with news that helicopters were inbound. Only the desperate work of keeping Harper breathing until the medevac could arrive. Only the knowledge that Sarah Bennett had crossed a line today that could never be uncrossed. That she had broken a promise to honor a deeper promise. That she had become a warrior to remain a healer. And that the weight of that choice would stay with her forever. The helicopter rotors beat the air like the wings of some mechanical angel descending into hell. Sarah Bennett knelt in the settling dust with her hands pressed against Lieutenant Colonel Harper's chest, counting heartbeats that came too slow and too weak. 60 seconds since the explosion. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. The medevac birds were still 5 minutes out, and Harper was fading with each labored breath. Chen appeared beside her with a fresh IV bag. We need to move him to the LZ, she said. Her face was streaked with blood from the scalp wound that had finally stopped bleeding. The cut would scar. They would all scar from this day. Not yet, Sarah said. She was listening to Harper's breathing, the wet rattle that meant fluid in the lungs. The punctured lung was filling with blood despite the chest seal. If they moved him too roughly, the internal bleeding could accelerate. But if they did not move him, the helicopters would have nowhere to land. Impossible choices, the kind that defined combat medicine. Thompson limped over carrying Mitchell in a fireman's carry. The big sergeant's leg wound had been tourniqueted, but he refused to sit down, refused to stop being useful. Some soldiers were built that way. They would keep moving until their bodies gave out because movement meant purpose, and purpose was the only thing keeping despair at bay. LZ is 50 meters north, Thompson said. In that depression where we moved after the explosion. Sarah made her decision. We go now, slow and steady. Chen, take his legs. Thompson, you walk rear security. If you see any Taliban moving, you drop Mitchell and you shoot first. They lifted Harper as gently as combat allowed and began the careful journey to the landing zone. Every step was measured. Every jostle could be fatal. Sarah walked backward, keeping her eyes on Harper's face, watching for any sign that the movement was killing him faster than the wounds. His eyes opened. Just a crack, barely conscious but aware enough to recognize her. Sarah, he whispered. The squad. Everyone is alive, she lied. Because Silva was dead and lying did not matter when the truth would only add weight to a dying man who was already carrying too much. Good, Harper breathed. That is good. His eyes closed again, and Sarah felt her chest tighten with something that might have been grief or might have been rage or might have been both. This man had served for 17 years, had led from the front, had kept his promises to dying fathers and living soldiers. And now he was bleeding out in the Afghan dirt because intelligence was wrong and plans fell apart, and war did not care about honor or duty or any of the things that made good men volunteer to stand between evil and home. They reached the landing zone as the first helicopter appeared over the ridge. A Black Hawk with Red Cross markings and door gunners scanning for threats. The pilot brought it in fast and low, flaring at the last second to settle on the uneven ground with all the grace of a falling anvil. Flight medics jumped out before the skids touched earth. Professionals, experienced. They took one look at Harper, and their expressions went carefully neutral in the way that medical personnel learn when the odds are bad, but giving up is not an option. Who is in command here? One medic shouted over the rotor wash. Chen pointed at Sarah. Sergeant Bennett, she called in the danger close artillery that saved us. The medic stared at Sarah, really looked at her, taking in the blood-soaked uniform, the rifle slung across her chest alongside the aid bag. The eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. You are the medic who did all this? The flight medic asked. Someone had to, Sarah said. Then she turned her attention back to Harper as they loaded him onto a stretcher. His blood pressure, his respiration rate, the 1,000 clinical details that stood between a patient and a statistic. They lifted Harper into the helicopter. Mitchell went next, then Thompson, who finally allowed himself to be treated. Chen climbed aboard to accompany them, her medical training making her the logical choice to monitor the wounded during the flight. The pilot leaned out. We can take one more. You should come, Sergeant. You are wounded. Sarah looked down at her thigh where the bullet had grazed her. The bleeding had stopped. The wound was superficial, painful but not life-threatening. I am staying, she said. The rest of my squad is still here. I do not leave them. The pilot nodded with the understanding of someone who had flown enough medevac missions to know that some soldiers could not be convinced to leave their people. He gave a thumbs up, and the Black Hawk lifted off, rotors beating the air into submission as it climbed toward the ridge and safety. Sarah watched it disappear and felt the adrenaline that had been sustaining her begin to crack. Her legs went weak. Her hands started to shake. The rifle she had been carrying suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. She sat down hard on the ground and only then realized she was still holding Harper's M4. His rifle. The weapon he had pressed into her hands and told her to use. The tool she had transformed from a medic into something else. Something that could kill as well as heal. Sarah looked at her hands. The right hand that had fired this rifle. The left hand that had set the timer on SO4 explosives. Both hands covered in blood and dust and cordite residue. These were not the clean hands of a healer anymore. These were the hands of a soldier who had made impossible choices and would have to live with them forever. She thought about her father, about the promise she had made in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and dying. First, do no harm, but harm was already here, and stopping it had required becoming part of it. The philosophical weight of that realization threatened to crush her. Sarge. Sarah looked up. Reyes stood there with his radio pack and an expression that said he had been trying to get her attention for a while. Reinforcements are 5 minutes out, he said. Full platoon from Firebase Lightning. But we have a problem. Sarah forced herself to focus, to compartmentalize, to be the soldier and leader her squad needed instead of the woman having an existential crisis about broken promises. What problem? Reyes pulled out a tablet showing thermal imagery from the Predator drone overhead. the same intelligence platform that had told them this compound held 3 fighters instead of 30. Sarah felt her jaw tighten at the irony. Taliban regrouping here, Reyes said, pointing to a cluster of heat signatures 200 meters to the east. 20 to 25 fighters. Looks like they are preparing for another assault before our reinforcements arrive. Sarah studied the imagery. The Taliban were bunching up in 2 groups, using natural cover to mask their approach. They would hit from 2 directions simultaneously, classic hammer and anvil, and Alpha Squad was down to 3 combat-effective soldiers with almost no ammunition. The mathematics did not work. They could not hold against another assault, which meant Sarah had to change the mathematics again. She looked at the terrain, at the compound ruins, at the depression where they had taken cover, at the approaches the Taliban would have to use. Her mind worked through the problem with a cold tactical clarity that felt foreign and familiar at the same time. This was not medical triage. This was combat triage, deciding where to allocate limited resources for maximum effect. Reyes, she said, you still have those frag grenades? 2, he confirmed. And you can call artillery from Firebase Lightning? They are standing by, Reyes said. But Sarge, we are danger close for artillery. Those shells land within 50 meters, and we are taking casualties from our own fire. I know, Sarah said. She was already calculating blast radius and fragmentation patterns and acceptable losses. The kind of math that would have horrified her a week ago. What is the time on target, if we call it now? 40 seconds, Reyes said. Sarah looked at the thermal imagery again. The Taliban were advancing in 2 groups, but they were using the same covered approaches. Textbook mistake. Concentrating force was good tactics unless the enemy knew exactly where you were concentrating and could turn that concentration into a killing field. Call the fire mission, Sarah ordered. Danger close. I will give you the grid. She rattled off coordinates pulled from the drone feed. Reyes repeated them back to Firebase Lightning. The artillery officer on the other end sounded young and uncertain. Alpha 1, those coordinates put you inside minimum safe distance. Confirm you want fire at that location. Sarah took the handset from Reyes. This is Sergeant Bennett. I am the senior combat effective soldier on site, and I am ordering this fire mission. Confirm you have the grid. Confirmed, came the reply. But Sergeant, regulations require I warn you that danger close fire missions have a high probability of friendly casualties. I am aware, Sarah said. Her voice was flat, empty of emotion. The voice of someone who had already made peace with the cost. We have adequate cover. Fire for effect. Rounds out, the artillery officer said. Impact in 40 seconds. Sarah grabbed Reyes. Everyone into the depression. Now. Heads down and stay down. The 3 surviving members of Alpha Squad scrambled into the natural fold in the earth that had saved them after the explosion. Sarah pulled Mitchell down beside her, even though he was only semi-conscious, and probably would not have tried to stand anyway. She pressed herself against the dirt and thought about physics and blast waves and acceptable losses. 30 seconds. She thought about her father, about whether he had ever called artillery onto his own position, about whether he had ever had to choose between probable death and certain death and decided probable was the better odds. 20 seconds. She thought about Harper bleeding out on a helicopter, about Silva dead under a poncho, about all the ways a person could die in war and all the ways they could try to prevent it. 10 seconds. She thought about the oath. First, do no harm. But harm was coming whether she wanted it or not. The Taliban were going to kill them all unless she killed the Taliban first. And the only tool she had left was artillery fire that might kill her own people in the process of saving them. 5 seconds. Sarah closed her eyes and wrapped her arms over her head and waited for the world to explode. The 155mm howitzer shells hit like the fist of an angry god. The earth convulsed. The air turned to hammer blows that crushed the breath from her lungs. The noise was beyond sound. It was a physical thing that battered eardrums and rattled bones and turned the world into pure concussive force. Sarah felt herself lifted and slammed back down, felt dirt rain on her helmet, felt the pressure wave try to turn her lungs inside out. The depression they were hiding in became a foxhole by default, the walls collapsing inward from the shock, burying them in loose earth that Sarah had to claw away from her face to breathe. The barrage lasted 30 seconds, 6 shells, each one a precisely calculated piece of mathematics designed to turn human beings into component parts. When it ended, the silence was absolute except for the ringing in Sarah's ears that would probably never completely go away. She lifted her head, looked out at where the Taliban positions had been. They were gone. Just craters and smoke and the scattered remains of men who had been alive 60 seconds ago and were now part of the earth they had been fighting for. Sarah felt nothing. No triumph, no regret. Just the cold recognition that she had made a call and it had worked, and 25 human beings were dead because of her decision. "Rhea's report," she said. Her voice sounded distant and strange. "I am alive," Reyes called back. He sounded surprised. "Mitchell?" The young private coughed. "Here, Sarge, still breathing." 3 soldiers left combat effective from a squad of 12. But 3 was more than 0. 3 was survival. 3 was victory measured in the brutal arithmetic of combat, where success was defined by who was still breathing when the shooting stopped. Sarah climbed out of the depression and surveyed the battlefield. The compound was ruins. The weapons cache was a crater. Taliban bodies lay scattered across terrain that looked like the surface of the moon. This place had been someone's home once. Maybe still was. But war had turned it into a graveyard, and Sarah had helped dig the graves. She picked up Harper's M4 from where it had fallen during the barrage. Checked the chamber. Still loaded, still ready, still waiting for her to make a choice about what kind of soldier she was going to be. The sound of approaching helicopters saved her from that decision. Not medevac this time. Transport. Carrying the reinforcements from Firebase Lightning. A full platoon of infantry soldiers who would secure the area and process the site and write reports about what had happened here. Sarah stood in the center of devastation and waited for them to arrive. Her uniform was caked with blood and dirt. Her aid bag was nearly empty. The rifle in her hands felt lighter than it had an hour ago, or maybe she was just getting used to the weight. The helicopters landed and soldiers poured out with weapons ready. A young lieutenant at the front, fresh from West Point probably, clean uniform, eyes wide at the destruction. "Who is the senior soldier on site?" the lieutenant demanded. Reyes pointed at Sarah. "Sergeant Bennett, sir." She took command when Lieutenant Colonel Harper went down. The lieutenant walked over, and Sarah could see him processing what he was looking at. A female medic covered in blood, holding a rifle with an aid bag on her back. The cognitive dissonance was written all across his face. "Sergeant," the lieutenant said carefully, "can you brief me on what happened here?" Sarah looked at him, at his clean uniform and uncertain eyes and the clipboard he was holding, like it could make sense of chaos. She thought about trying to explain. About the ambush and the IED and the impossible choices. About picking up a rifle when she had promised her dying father she never would. About calling artillery onto her own position because the alternative was death. But the words would not come. How could she explain any of this to someone who had not been here, who had not felt the weight of command settle onto shoulders trained for healing instead of killing? "We were ambushed," Sarah said simply. "Heavy casualties. I made the calls necessary to keep my people alive." The lieutenant nodded like he understood, even though he clearly did not. He looked around at the destruction, at the crater where the weapons cache had been, at the bodies. "Jesus," he muttered. "You did all this?" "Someone had to," Sarah said. The same words she had told the medevac pilot. The same words she would probably be saying for the rest of her life. The platoon medic approached, a specialist with kind eyes and clean hands who reminded Sarah of herself 8 years ago. "Sergeant, you are wounded. Let me take a look at that leg." Sarah glanced down at the bullet graze on her thigh. She had forgotten about it entirely. The pain was distant and unimportant compared to everything else. "It can wait," she said. "Ma'am, you should really let me—" "I said it can wait," Sarah snapped. Then softer. "There are bodies that need processing. Silva, Specialist Nathan Silva. He is in the main building. Make sure he is treated with respect." "Yes, Sergeant," the medic said quietly, understanding in his eyes now. The understanding that came from recognizing someone carrying weight that could not be shared. Sarah walked away from the lieutenant and his clipboard and his questions. Walked toward the depression where they had weathered the artillery, where 3 soldiers out of 12 had survived because she had been willing to call fire onto her own position. Reyes was helping Mitchell to his feet. The young private was pale and shaky, but alive. When he saw Sarah, he tried to straighten up, tried to look like a soldier instead of a terrified 19-year-old who had almost died a dozen times in the last hour. "Sarge," Mitchell said. His voice cracked. "I wanted to say thank you for saving us." Sarah looked at him, at his youth and fear and desperate gratitude. She thought about all the ways she had saved him, the medical treatment, the tactical decisions, the violence she had committed to keep him breathing. "I did my job," she said. "That is all." But it was not all, it was everything. It was the complete transformation of who she had been into something new. Something that could hold a rifle in one hand and a bandage in the other and use whichever tool the situation required. The sound of rotor blades announced another helicopter. This one was different. Command and control. Flying low over the compound in a wide circle. Assessing, recording, turning this battlefield into data that would be analyzed by people who had never heard a bullet crack past their head. Sarah watched the helicopter and thought about the after-action reports that would be written, the investigations, the questions about why a medic had taken command and called danger close artillery and deliberately destroyed a weapons cache that might have contained valuable intelligence. She thought about medals and commendations and how meaningless they seemed when measured against the weight of Silva's body and Harper's blood and the faces of Taliban fighters seen through a rifle scope. The helicopter banked away, and Sarah was left standing in the ruins with Harper's M4 in her hands and the certain knowledge that she had become exactly what her father had feared she would become, a soldier who knew how to kill. But she had also remained what she had always been, a medic who knew how to save. And maybe that was the only way to survive war, to be both things at once, to carry the rifle and the aid bag, to understand that healing sometimes required violence, and violence always required healing. Sarah looked down at her hands, still covered in blood, still shaking slightly from adrenaline crash. She spread her fingers and studied them in the harsh Afghan sunlight. The right hand had fired a rifle and killed men she could not count because she had stopped counting after the third one. The left hand had set a tourniquet on Harper and kept him alive long enough for the medevac. Both hands were necessary. Both hands were her. She clenched them into fists and felt the weight settle. Not just the weight of what she had done today, but the weight of what she would carry for the rest of her life. The faces, the choices, the knowledge that she had broken a promise to keep a deeper promise. Sergeant Bennett, Sarah turned. A sergeant major from the reinforcing platoon stood there. Older, gray hair and hard eyes and the bearing of a man who had seen enough combat to recognize it in others. Yes, Sergeant Major. Word just came through on the command net, he said. Lieutenant Colonel Harper made it to Bagram. He is stable, critical, but stable. Surgeons say he will probably make it. Sarah felt something break loose in her chest. Relief, maybe? Or grief delayed? Or just the human need to know that the price paid had bought something worth having. Thank you, Sergeant Major, she managed. The Sergeant Major studied her for a long moment. Sarah had the sense of being evaluated, measured, judged by someone who understood the cost of command. What you did here today, he said quietly. Calling that fire mission. Taking command when your officer went down. That took courage. Or desperation, Sarah said. Sometimes they are the same thing. He paused. Your father was David Bennett, served in Iraq. It was not a question. Sarah nodded anyway. I knew him, the sergeant major said. Good man, struggled with what war made him do, but he did it anyway because the alternative was letting his soldiers die. You are just like him. Sarah thought about her father in his hospital bed, about the promise and the weight and the choices that defined a life, about becoming what you feared in order to protect what you loved. I broke a promise to him today, she said. Swore I would never pick up a rifle, that I would only heal. The sergeant major shook his head slowly. You kept the promise, that mattered. You kept your people alive. That is the only oath that counts in the end. He walked away, and Sarah was left alone with the rifle and the aid bag and the weight that would never completely leave. The sun was setting by the time the site was secured and the bodies processed and the intelligence gathered. Sarah sat on a piece of rubble and watched the light die over the Hindu Kush. The mountains turned gold, then red, then purple in the fading light. Beautiful in the way that all harsh things were beautiful when seen from a distance. Chen found her there. The specialist had a fresh bandage on her head and exhaustion written across her face. She sat down beside Sarah without asking permission. They are saying you are going to get the Medal of Honor for this, Chen said. Sarah said nothing. Mitchell wrote a letter to his mother. He asked me to give it to you, said you should read it. Chen held out an envelope, creased and stained with blood and dirt. Sarah took it with hands that had steadied sometime in the last few hours. She opened it. The letter was short, written in pencil and handwriting that shook. Mom, if you are reading this, then I did not make it. I want you to know I was not alone. Sergeant Bennett was with me. She saved my life 3 times today. Once with a tourniquet, once by calling artillery onto our position, and once by being brave enough to become something she did not want to become so that I could go home. I do not understand war. I do not understand why good people have to do terrible things. But I understand that Sergeant Bennett is a hero, not because she killed the enemy, but because she was willing to carry the weight of killing so that others would not have to. Tell her thank you from me. Tell her I will live a good life because she made sure I had a life to live. Your son, Kyle. Sarah read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it in her pocket next to her father's dog tags. Two pieces of paper and metal that weighed almost nothing but felt heavier than the rifle and aid bag combined. He is going to be okay, Chen said. Mitchell, the doctors say he will recover fully. Good, Sarah said. That is good. They sat in silence as the last light died and the stars came out over Afghanistan. The same stars that had watched over this valley for thousands of years. The same stars that would watch long after this war was forgotten and these soldiers were dust. Chen finally spoke. What you did today. Becoming a warrior. Does it feel like you lost something? Sarah thought about the question. About clean hands and broken promises and the oath she had sworn in a ceremony that felt like a lifetime ago. Yes, she said. But I gained something too. What? Understanding, Sarah said. Of what my father carried, of why soldiers make the choices they make, of how you can do terrible things for good reasons and still have to live with them. Chen nodded slowly. My daughter is going to ask me one day what I did in the war. I am not sure what I will tell her. Tell her you did what was necessary, Sarah said. Tell her you were brave enough to become what the moment required. Tell her that being a soldier means carrying weight that civilians never have to feel. And if she asks if it was worth it, Sarah looked at her hands, at the rifle and the aid bag, at the mountains and the stars and the long road ahead. Tell her yes, Sarah said finally, because she exists, because you came home, because the weight we carry means others do not have to. Chen stood and walked away, and Sarah sat alone in the Afghan dark and felt the weight settle into her bones where it would stay forever. She had become a warrior today, but she had not stopped being a healer. She was both now, would always be both. And the price of that duality was carrying the memory of every life saved and every life taken and knowing that both were necessary and neither was sufficient and the only way forward was to keep walking with the weight and hope that at the end of the road it would mean something. Sarah stood, shouldered the rifle and the aid bag, walked toward the helicopters that would carry her back to base and reports and questions and the long process of becoming someone who could live with what she had done. The weight of the rifle was lighter than it had been this morning. Or maybe she was just stronger. Maybe that was what war did. It did not make the load lighter. It made you strong enough to carry it. Either way, Sarah Bennett walked into the darkness carrying both the tools of healing and the weapons of war. And somewhere above the Hindu Kush, her father's ghost walked beside her, proud and sad in equal measure, knowing his daughter had learned the hardest lesson of all. That love sometimes looks like violence. That healing sometimes requires harm. And that the best soldiers are not the ones who enjoy fighting, but the ones who fight anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. The helicopters lifted off into the night and carried Sarah away from the battlefield, but not from the weight. That would stay with her forever. And maybe that was how it should be. The price of being strong enough to protect what you love. Walter Reed Medical Center smelled like every hospital Sarah Bennett had ever been in. Antiseptic and floor wax and the particular sterile emptiness of places where people came to be broken down and rebuilt. She stood outside Lieutenant Colonel Harper's room for the third time in as many days, her hand raised to knock, unable to make her knuckles connect with the door. Inside that room was a man who had survived because she had dragged him through enemy fire and tourniqueted his leg and kept him breathing when his body wanted to quit. Inside was also a man who had watched her transform from healer to killer, who had pressed his rifle into her hands and ordered her to become something she had promised her dying father she would never be. Sarah did not know which conversation terrified her more. She lowered her hand and turned to walk away for the third time when the door opened. Are you going to keep lurking out here, or are you going to come in and talk to me? Harper's voice was weak but recognizable. Sarah turned back to find him leaning against the doorframe in a hospital gown, his right leg encased in an external fixator that looked like medieval torture equipment. His face was pale and thinner than she remembered, but his eyes were clear and aware and looking at her with an expression she could not read. Sir, you should be in bed, Sarah said automatically, medical training overriding everything else. Probably, Harper agreed, but I have been lying down for 3 weeks and I am tired of staring at ceiling tiles. Come in, Sergeant. That is an order. Sarah followed him into the room. Harper moved slowly back to his bed, using a walker that made him look decades older than 35. The external fixator on his leg was holding together a femur that had been shattered by shrapnel. The doctor said he would walk again. Probably, maybe without a limp if he was lucky and committed to physical therapy. He would never run again, never jump out of aircraft or lead men through mountain passes. His days as a field commander were over. Sarah wondered if he blamed her for saving him. "Sit," Harper said, gesturing to a chair beside the bed. "You look like you have not slept in a week." "I sleep," Sarah lied, "just not well." The truth was she barely slept at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw faces. Taliban fighters viewed through a rifle scope in the moment before she pulled the trigger. Silva dead under a poncho, Mitchell bleeding in the dust, Harper's blood pooling beneath him as she cranked a tourniquet tight enough to save his life. And behind all those faces, her father, disappointed, sad. Knowing his daughter had broken the promise she made at his deathbed, Harper studied her for a long moment. "Talk to me, Sarah." "About what, sir?" "About what is eating you from the inside. About why you have been standing outside my door for 3 days, unable to knock. About why you look like someone who won a war but lost a battle that mattered more." Sarah looked down at her hands. Clean now, scrubbed and sanitized and showing no trace of the blood that had covered them 3 weeks ago. But she could still feel it, could still see the stains that soap could not wash away. "I killed people," she said quietly. "A lot of people, and I do not know how to reconcile that with who I am supposed to be." "Who are you supposed to be?" Harper asked. "A healer, a medic, someone who saves lives instead of taking them." Harper leaned back against his pillows. "Let me tell you what I saw that day in Kannar province. I saw a medic who treated wounded soldiers under fire, who dragged her commanding officer to safety, who assaulted an enemy position alone to resupply her unit, who called danger close artillery to save her squad, and yes, who killed enemy combatants in the process. What part of that contradicts being a healer?" "All of it," Sarah said. "I swore an oath. First, do no harm. I broke that oath." "No," Harper said firmly. "You expanded it. Harm was already there. The Taliban were going to kill all of us. You stopped that harm, prevented it, healed the wound before it could be inflicted. That is still being a medic. It is just a different kind of medicine." Sarah shook her head. "That sounds like rationalization. Like excusing what I did by calling it something noble." "It is not rationalization," Harper said. "It is reality. War does not give you clean choices. It gives you terrible options and makes you pick the least terrible one. You did that. You made hard calls that kept people alive, including me." He paused, his expression softening. "Your father struggled with this too. Did you know that?" Sarah looked up. Harper had never talked about her father beyond acknowledging that they had served together. "He saved my life in Iraq," Harper continued. 2004, our convoy hit an IED. I was trapped in a burning vehicle. Your father pulled me out and treated my wounds under fire, just like you did 3 weeks ago. And afterwards, when I thanked him, you know what he said?" "What?" "He said saving one life by risking his own felt right. But he had also shot 3 insurgents during the extraction. Killed them to protect the medics trying to reach the wounded. And he asked me if that made him a murderer or a hero or something in between." "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked. "I told him it made him human. That carrying the weight of those deaths while still choosing to save lives was what separated soldiers from killers. Intent matters. You did not kill because you wanted to. You killed because the alternative was letting good people die." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "But I should have found another way. A better way." "There was no other way," Harper said gently. "Trust me, I have been lying here for 3 weeks replaying that firefight in my head, looking for the decision point where things could have gone differently. And there is not one. The ambush was perfectly executed. We were outnumbered and outgunned. Without your actions, we all die. Silva dies, Mitchell dies, I die. All of us." "Silva died anyway," Sarah said. The words came out harder than she intended. Harper's expression flickered with pain. "Yes, he did. And that is on me, not you. I was in command. I approved the mission based on faulty intelligence. Silva's death is my responsibility. But I could not save him." "You saved everyone else," Harper said. 8 soldiers came home because of you. 8 families did not get the knock on the door from casualty notification officers. 8 people are alive right now because you were brave enough to become what the situation required. Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the absolution he was offering. But the weight was still there, heavy and unyielding and demanding to be acknowledged. I have been having nightmares, she admitted. Every night, I see their faces, the ones I killed, and I try to tell myself they were enemy combatants, that they were trying to kill us. But they had faces, lives, families probably. Harper nodded slowly. That means you are still human, that the killing cost you something. The soldiers who scare me are the ones who do not have those nightmares, who pull the trigger without conscience. You are not one of those soldiers, Sarah. You did what was necessary and it hurt you. That is how it should be. Does it get easier? Sarah asked. Living with it? No, Harper said honestly. It gets familiar. You learn to carry the weight, but it never gets light. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside the window, Washington, D.C. continued its business. Traffic and pedestrians in the ordinary rhythms of a city at peace, while soldiers fought wars in mountains half a world away. There is something else, Harper said. The investigation. Sarah had been expecting this. The Judge Advocate General's office had opened an inquiry into her actions. Some officers questioned whether a medic taking offensive action violated the Geneva Convention, whether calling danger close artillery without proper authorization exceeded her authority, whether the destruction of the weapons cache had been tactically sound or reckless. They are going to clear you, Harper said. I testified yesterday, told them everything about the ambush, the IED, how you took command when I went down, how your decisions saved 8 American lives and prevented a Taliban attack on Firebase Lightning that would have killed hundreds. What about the regulations? Sarah asked. The rules about medics and offensive operations? Harper smiled grimly. Rules are written by people who were not there, who did not have to choose between dying with clean hands and living with dirty ones. The investigating officers understand that. They have been in combat. They know the difference between a soldier who violated regulations and a soldier who did what had to be done. When will they make their decision? Any day now, Harper said. But Sarah, even if they clear you officially, you still have to clear yourself. That is the harder verdict to live with. Sarah knew he was right. The official investigation did not matter nearly as much as the internal one. The trial that happened every night when she closed her eyes and faced the jury of her own conscience. Have you talked to anyone? Harper asked. A counselor, a chaplain? Sarah shook her head. You should, Harper said. This is not something you should carry alone. I am fine, sir. You are not fine, Harper said firmly. You are a combat veteran with PTSD showing textbook symptoms, insomnia, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts. You need help, Sarah. There is no shame in that. I will think about it, Sarah said, which was what people said when they had no intention of following advice but wanted to end the conversation. Harper saw through it immediately. That is an order, Sergeant. You will schedule an appointment with the VA Mental Health Services. You will attend, and you will be honest about what you are experiencing. Because if you do not deal with this now, it will destroy you later. I have seen it happen too many times. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to say she was strong enough to handle it on her own. But looking at Harper's face, seeing the concern and understanding there, she found she could not lie to him. Yes, sir, she said quietly. Good, Harper said. Now get out of here. I need to do physical therapy, and I do not want witnesses to how badly I'm going to fail at it. Sarah stood to leave, but paused at the door. Sir, thank you for everything, for keeping your promise to my father. I did not keep it, Harper said. You did. By surviving, by coming home, by being strong enough to carry what war made you carry. Sarah nodded and left before the tears could start. The envelope arrived 2 days later. 3 of them, actually. Sarah sat at the small desk in her temporary barracks room and stared at them like they might explode. The first was official. Department of the Army letterhead. The investigation results. She opened it with hands that trembled slightly. The inquiry had concluded that Sergeant Sarah Bennett's actions during the engagement in Kunar province were consistent with her duties as a combat medic and non-commissioned officer. While certain decisions fell outside standard protocols, they were deemed appropriate given the tactical situation and the imminent threat to friendly forces. No disciplinary action recommended. Case closed. Sarah read it twice, felt nothing. The Army had absolved her. The regulations had been satisfied. She was officially a good soldier who had made hard choices. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt hollow. The second envelope was handwritten. Return address in Texas. She recognized the name. Catherine Mitchell, Kyle's mother. Sarah's hands shook harder as she opened it. Dear Sergeant Bennett, my son came home 3 days ago. The doctors say he will make a full recovery. The scar on his neck will fade but never completely disappear. He says that is okay. He says it will remind him every day that he is alive because of you. Kyle told me what happened in Afghanistan, how you treated his wounds under fire, how you dragged him to safety, how you became a warrior to protect him and the others. He said you saved his life 3 times that day. But more than that, you gave him a future. Tomorrow he starts classes at the community college. He wants to be a teacher, work with kids, make a difference. None of that would have happened without you. I know from Kyle that what you did cost you something, that you had to become someone you did not want to be. I cannot imagine how heavy that must feel, but I want you to know that because of your sacrifice, my son gets to live his life. He gets to find love and build a family and grow old. You gave me my son back. There are no words for what that means to a mother. Thank you, not just for saving Kyle's life, but for being brave enough to carry the burden of what that required. With eternal gratitude, Catherine Mitchell. Sarah read the letter 3 times, felt something crack inside her chest, something that had been frozen since the day of the firefight. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small box where she kept her father's dog tags and the other things that mattered. One life saved, one family made whole, one future that would not have existed without her choices. Maybe that was worth something. The third envelope made her hands go still. The return address was written in script that looked Arabic. Forwarded through military intelligence channels, she almost did not open it, almost threw it away without reading. But something made her slide her finger under the seal. Inside was a single page. The English was rough but readable. Dear American soldier, my name is Amira. I am widow of Rashid, who you killed 3 years ago in Kunar province. Intelligence find this letter when they search Taliban records. They give to me. They say maybe I want to know who killed my husband. I do not know why I write to you. Maybe because anger is heavy and I am tired of carrying it. Maybe because I want you to know what you take from me. Rashid was 26 years old. He was teacher before Taliban forced him to fight. He loved poetry and children. He was good man in bad situation. You kill him and now my 2 sons grow up without father. I hate you for this. I think I will always hate you. But I also read a report. It say you are medic. It say you saved many lives. It say you did not want to kill but had no choice. I do not forgive you. Maybe I never forgive you. But I understand that war make people do terrible things. You are soldier. He was soldier. Soldiers fight. That is war. I want you to know his name. Rashid Ahmadi. He was real person. He had dreams. He wanted to see his sons become men. He wrote poetry about morning light on mountains. Please do not forget him. If you forget him, his death mean nothing. Amira Ahmadi. Sarah's vision blurred. She set the letter down with hands that would not stop shaking. Read it again through tears she could no longer control. Rashid Ahmadi, 26 years old, a teacher, a poet, a father, a human being she had killed. The weight of that knowledge crashed down on her with physical force. She had known intellectually that the men she killed were people, had families, had lives. But knowing it abstractly and confronting it directly were different things entirely. Rashid Ahmadi had sons, 2 boys who would grow up without a father because Sarah Bennett had pulled a trigger, and his widow wanted her to remember, to carry the weight of that name and that life and acknowledge the cost. Sarah pulled out a notebook, opened to a blank page. At the top, she wrote 2 words, the list. Underneath, she wrote the first name. Rashid Ahmadi, age 26, teacher, poet, father of 2. She did not know the names of the others she had killed, did not have the intelligence reports or the ability to research them. But she would carry Rashid's name, would remember that he was more than an enemy combatant, more than a target. He was a person whose death had cost his family everything. And beside Rashid's name, Sarah started a second list. Kyle Mitchell, alive, going to college, future teacher. Rebecca Chen, alive, home with her daughter. Marcus Thompson, alive, coaching Little League. David Reyes, alive, walked his sister down the aisle. Ryan Harper, alive, teaching military history. 8 names in total, 8 people who were breathing because Sarah had been willing to do what was necessary. She looked at both lists, the taken and the saved, the price paid and the value purchased, the mathematics of war that never balanced but had to be calculated anyway. Sarah made a decision. Every year on the anniversary of that day in Kunar province, she would read both lists, would remember every name, would never let herself forget the questors de reason. The burden was hers to carry. She would not put it down by forgetting. She would carry it by remembering. The phone rang. Sarah almost did not answer, but the number was local and something made her pick up. Sergeant Bennett? This is Dr. Martinez from the VA. Lieutenant Colonel Harper asked me to reach out. He said you might be ready to talk. Sarah looked at the letters spread across her desk, at the 2 lists in her notebook, at her hands that would never feel completely clean, no matter how much she scrubbed them. Yes, she said, I think I am. 3 months later, Sarah stood in formation at Fort Bragg wearing her dress uniform with new stripes sewn on the sleeves. Staff Sergeant now, promoted for actions in combat. The ceremony was brief and professional and attended by most of Alpha Squad. Mitchell was there in civilian clothes, already looking more like a college student than a soldier. Chen had brought her daughter, who waved at Sarah with gap-toothed enthusiasm. Thompson stood tall, despite the limp he would probably always have. Reyes wore a wedding ring and kept checking his phone for photos his wife was sending from their honeymoon. Harper watched from the wheelchair, his legs still healing but his eyes clear and proud. After the ceremony, they gathered at a restaurant in Fayetteville. The conversation was cautious at first. No one wanted to talk about Afghanistan. No one wanted to revisit that day. But eventually, inevitably, someone mentioned Silva. He would have been proud of you, Sarge, Thompson said quietly. What you did, taking command, bringing us home. I did not bring everyone home, Sarah said. The guilt was still there, probably always would be. You brought home everyone who could be brought home, Chen corrected. Silva's death was not on you. Sarah wanted to believe that, was learning to believe it through therapy and time, and the slow process of accepting that she had done her best in an impossible situation. Harper raised his glass of water. To Silva, he said, and to the squad that survived, and to Sergeant Bennett, who proved that being a healer sometimes requires being a warrior. They drank, and for a moment Sarah allowed herself to feel something other than guilt. Not pride exactly, but perhaps acceptance. She had made choices. Those choices had consequences. She would carry those consequences for the rest of her life. But she was still here, still breathing, still capable of saving lives. And maybe that was enough. After dinner, Sarah walked Harper to his car. He moved better now with a cane instead of a wheelchair. The doctors said he would never be fully combat ready, but he was healing. They are talking about the Medal of Honor, Harper said as he settled into the driver's seat. For you, for what you did that day. Sarah shook her head. I do not want it. You do not get a choice, Harper said. The medal is not for you. It is for everyone who sees it and understands that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. I am not extraordinary, Sarah said. I was just scared and desperate and trying to keep my people alive. That is what makes it extraordinary, Harper replied. You did not want to be a hero. You did not want to kill. You just did what was necessary despite the cost. That is the definition of courage. He started the engine but paused before driving away. Your father would be proud of you, Sarah. I know you struggle with whether you broke your promise to him, but I think he would understand. I think he would say you kept the promise that mattered most. Which promise? Sarah asked. To come home, Harper said. To survive. To be strong enough to carry the weight and still choose to keep saving lives. He drove away, and Sarah stood in the parking lot watching his taillights disappear. She thought about her father, about the promise made in a hospital room, about clean hands and dirty choices. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app, found the 2 lists she kept there now, the taken and the saved, added one more name to the saved list, Sarah Bennett, alive, still fighting to be both healer and warrior, still carrying the weight. It was not redemption, it was not absolution, but it was survival. And in war, sometimes survival was the only victory that mattered. Sarah looked up at the North Carolina sky. Somewhere up there, past the clouds and distance, her father was either proud or disappointed, or maybe both. She would never know for certain. But she knew this. She had made choices. She had saved lives. She had killed to protect what she loved. And she would spend the rest of her life trying to make peace with the person those choices had made her become. The weight was hers. The burden was real. But she was strong enough to carry it. She had proven that much at least. Sarah got in her car and drove toward tomorrow, carrying the past behind her and the future ahead. Both hands on the wheel, both lists in her heart, both parts of herself learning to coexist. Healer and warrior, broken and whole, human and flawed, and still fighting to be better than the worst thing she had ever done. That would have to be enough, because it was all she had. And sometimes what you have is exactly what you need to survive. The East Room of the White House was filled with people who mattered to other people. Generals with chests full of ribbons, politicians with practiced smiles, family members clutching photographs of soldiers who would never attend ceremonies like this. And in the back corner, standing alone near the doorway as if ready to flee at any moment, a man who did not belong. Sarah Bennett saw him immediately. Even in a room filled with 200 people, even with all eyes supposedly on her as she stood at attention, waiting for the President of the United States to drape a medal around her neck, she saw him. He was Middle Eastern, early 30s, wearing an ill-fitting suit that suggested he did not own formal clothes and had borrowed these for the occasion. His eyes met hers across the crowded room and held for 3 seconds that felt like 3 lifetimes. Then he raised his right hand slowly to his temple, a salute, uncertain and unpracticed but unmistakable in its meaning. Sarah's breath caught. She knew that face, had seen it in intelligence photos, had memorized it during the long nights when sleep would not come and memory would not fade. Khalid Rahman, the Taliban fighter she had saved in 2010, the one who had surrendered information that prevented an ambush and saved 40 American lives, the one who had apparently survived the war and somehow made it to the United States and was now standing in the White House watching the woman who had spared his life receive the nation's highest military honor. The president began speaking. Sarah heard none of it. Her mind was fracturing between past and present, between the woman who had once pressed gauze to an enemy's wounds and believed healing was enough, and the soldier who now understood that sometimes mercy and violence were 2 sides of the same terrible coin. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty, the president read from a citation that had been written by people who were not there and could never truly understand what that day had cost. The medal was heavy, heavier than it should be. 1 ounce of metal and ribbon that somehow weighed more than Harper's rifle and her aid bag combined. The president shook her hand, cameras flashed, people applauded, and Sarah stood frozen, feeling the weight settle around her neck while her eyes kept finding Khalidi in the back of the room. When the ceremony ended and the receiving line began, Sarah moved through it mechanically, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, nodding at words she did not hear. Her entire focus was on not losing sight of the man by the door. The ghost made flesh, the living reminder that war was never as simple as heroes and villains. Master Sergeant Chen was there with her daughter, now 9 years old and gap-toothed, and staring at Sarah like she was Captain America. Sergeant First Class Thompson brought his boys, both wearing Little League uniforms. Mitchell came with his mother, Catherine, who hugged Sarah so hard the metal dug into both their chests. Reyes stood with his wife and new baby, a daughter he had named Hope because that seemed appropriate. And Harper. Lieutenant Colonel Harper retired, walking with only a slight limp now. His leg had healed as well as the doctor said it would. He would never run again, but he could walk, and that was enough. He gripped Sarah's hand firmly. "Your father would have been so proud," he said quietly, "and I am honored to have served with you." "Thank you, sir," Sarah managed, "for everything." When the receiving line finally ended and the crowd began to disperse toward the reception, Sarah looked back toward the doorway. Khalid was still there, waiting. Their eyes met again and he gestured slightly toward the hallway. An invitation, a request for conversation that Sarah knew she could not refuse, even though every instinct screamed at her to walk away. She excused herself from the festivities and walked toward a reckoning she had not known was coming. They found a quiet alcove away from the reception. 2 people who should have been enemies standing in the marble halls of American power, separated by language and culture, and a war that had tried to kill them both. Khalid spoke first. His English was careful and precise, learned from textbooks and shaped by necessity. "You remember me," he said. It was not a question. "I remember." "I remember," Sarah confirmed. "You were wounded in Helmand Province, 2010. 3 gunshot wounds to the chest. I treated you." "You saved me," Khalid corrected. "When your officer said to leave me, you refused." Sarah nodded slowly. "That seems like a different lifetime. For me also, Khalid said. That day changed everything. After I recovered, I realized I did not want to die for the Taliban, did not want to kill for them. I gave information to your forces, helped them. Eventually, they brought me to America as interpreter. The words hung between them. Sarah thought about the chain of causation. The bullet she had not fired, the life she had saved, the intelligence that had prevented an ambush. 40 soldiers who went home because she had chosen healing over expedience. Why are you here, Sarah asked, at this ceremony? Because I needed you to know, Khalid said. That mercy matters. That choosing to save instead of kill can change more than one life. You saved me, and I saved others, and those others saved others. The ripples go far. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. But I also need you to know about Rashid. Sarah went very still. Rashid Ahmadi, the name on her list. The teacher, poet father she had killed 3 years after saving Khalid. You knew him, Sarah said softly. He was my cousin, Khalid confirmed. Good man, gentle, loved his children. The Taliban forced him to fight by threatening his family. He did not want to be soldier, but he had no choice. I am sorry, Sarah said. The words felt inadequate, microscopic against the weight of what she had taken. I know you are, Khalid said. I read the intelligence report. I know what happened that day. The ambush, the IED, how you had to become warrior to save your people. Rashid would understand. He became warrior for the same reason, to protect family. That does not make it right, Sarah said. No, Khalid agreed, but it makes it human. War is not about right and wrong. It is about impossible choices. You chose to save your soldiers. Rashid chose to protect his family. Both choices led to his death. Both of you are responsible. Neither of you are guilty. Sarah shook her head. That is too easy. Absolution without accountability. Khalid's expression hardened slightly. You think you are the only one who carries weight? I carry Rashid too. I gave intelligence that led to raids that killed people I knew. People from my village. I made choices that saved American lives and cost Afghan lives. I am translator now, but my hands are also bloody. We all carry the war. The question is whether we let it crush us or whether we make the weight mean something. Sarah looked at this man, this enemy turned ally, this living embodiment of the complexity she had been struggling with for 5 years. How do you make it mean something, she asked. By remembering, Khalid said. By refusing to forget their names. By living in a way that honors both the saved and the taken. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. From this, he extracted a photograph. Faded, creased, showing 2 young men standing in front of mountains with arms around each other's shoulders. Both smiling. Both alive. This is me and Rashid, Khalid said. Taken before the war. Before we knew what we would become. He held it out. Sarah took it with hands that trembled. Keep this, Khalid said. Remember he was real. Had joy. Had love. And when you read your lists, remember that saving me led to consequences you could not predict. Good and bad, that is the nature of war. That is the burden we carry. Sarah looked at the photograph. At 2 young men who did not know that one would save American lives and the other would die at American hands. At the innocence that war would steal from both of them. Why give this to me? Sarah asked. Because you need to forgive yourself, Khalid said. And you cannot do that until you fully accept what you did. The good and the terrible. All of it. You are healer and warrior. You save and you kill. You are not one thing, you are both. And that is what makes you strong enough to teach others. Sarah looked up sharply. How do you know about that? Khalid smiled slightly. I work with military intelligence. I hear things. I know you are going to Fort Jackson to train new medics, to teach them what you learned. That is supposed to be classified, Sarah said. Everything is classified until it matters, Khalid replied. And this matters. You will teach them to be like you, to carry the rifle in the aid bag, to understand that healing sometimes requires violence. That is important. The next generation needs to know. They stood in silence for a long moment. 2 people who had been shaped by war into something neither had wanted to become. 2 survivors trying to make sense of the weight they carried. Finally, Khalid extended his hand. Thank you, he said, for my life, for choosing mercy when you did not have to, for proving that even in war, humanity can survive. Sarah took his hand. Thank you, she said, for Rashid's memory, for the reminder that the people we fight are people, for showing me that the ripples go both ways. They shook hands in the hallway of the White House, while a reception continued without them. Then Khalid turned and walked away, carrying his own weight, leaving Sarah with a photograph and an understanding that felt like the beginning of something she did not yet have words for. Not forgiveness, not exactly, but perhaps acceptance. The recognition that she had done terrible things for necessary reasons and would have to learn to live with both the terrible and the necessary. Sarah returned to the reception, found Harper watching her with knowing eyes. "You okay?" he asked. "I will be," Sarah said. "Eventually." 5 years later, Master Sergeant Sarah Bennett stood in front of 40 young soldiers at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The combat medic training facility was new, state-of-the-art, funded in part by the reforms that had come after Sarah's actions in Afghanistan led to a complete revision of combat medic doctrine. On the wall behind her hung two things: her Medal of Honor in a glass case, and beside it a photograph. Rashid Ahmadi, teacher, poet, father, the first name on her list. The students stared at both with confusion and curiosity. "What do you see on that wall?" Sarah asked. Her voice carried the authority of 15 years in uniform and 5 years teaching soldiers who would face the same impossible choices she had faced. "Your Medal of Honor, ma'am," a young specialist named Rodriguez called out. "What else?" "A photograph, ma'am." "Of who?" The specialist hesitated. "I do not know, ma'am." "His name was Rashid Ahmadi," Sarah said. 26 years old, school teacher, loved poetry, father of 2 boys. I killed him in Afghanistan in 2013. The room went silent. 40 young faces processing information that did not fit their expectations. The Medal of Honor was supposed to represent heroism, glory, not the acknowledgement of a life taken. "I did not hang that medal to make you admire me," Sarah continued. "I hung Rashid to make you remember. Every person you save in your career as a combat medic is a human being with a name and a story. And every person you might have to kill to protect those you save is also a human being with a name and a story." She paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "You are here to learn how to be combat medics, how to treat wounds, how to save lives. But you also need to understand that sometimes saving lives requires taking them. That the rifle and the aid bag are both tools. That you might have to choose which one to use, and that choice will stay with you forever." A hand went up. Private Emma Santos, 19 years old, fresh out of basic training, still believing the world was made of clear lines between right and wrong. "Ma'am," Santos said nervously, "are you saying we should be ready to kill people?" "I am saying you should be ready to do whatever is necessary to bring your people home," Sarah replied. "And you should understand the cost of that necessity. You should know that every choice has weight. Every life saved is a miracle. Every life taken is a tragedy. And a good medic carries both." Another hand, Specialist Marcus Webb, 22, prior service Army National Guard. Eyes that had already seen more than most civilians would see in a lifetime. "Ma'am," Webb said, "how do you live with it? The knowing you killed someone?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. This was the question she had been waiting for, the one that mattered more than any technical skill she could teach. "You live with it by remembering," she said, "by refusing to forget their names, by making sure their deaths meant something, by saving enough lives that the scale tips toward healing even though it never balances." She pulled out her phone, opened her notes app, showed them the 2 lists she kept there. "This is the taken," she said, "Rashid Ahmadi and others I killed. I read these names every year on the anniversary of that day. I remember they were real, that their deaths cost their families everything." She scrolled down. "This is the saved: Kyle Mitchell, Rebecca Chen, Marcus Thompson, David Reyes, Ryan Harper, 8 soldiers who came home because I was willing to do what was necessary, plus the 40 who survived because intelligence prevented their ambush, plus every patient I have treated in 15 years. She looked up at the class. "The taken list is shorter than the saved list," Sarah said. "That has to be enough, because the alternative is letting guilt destroy you, is forgetting that the reason you became a warrior was to remain a healer." Santos raised her hand again. "Ma'am, are you saying it is okay to kill as long as you save more than you take?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "I am saying it is never okay, but sometimes it is necessary, and necessity does not erase guilt. It just gives it context. You will carry that weight forever if you do what I did, but you carry it because the alternative is letting good people die, and that weight is even heavier." The class sat in silence, processing, understanding beginning to dawn that the oath they had taken was more complicated than they had imagined. Webb spoke again. Ma'am, what is the hardest part of being both healer and warrior? Sarah thought about the question, about Harper's blood on her hands and Silva's body under a poncho, and Khalid's salute in the White House and the photograph of Rashid she kept in her wallet. The hardest part, she said slowly, is the moment when you realize you cannot be one without the other. That the rifle protects the aid bag and the aid bag justifies the rifle. That you are not choosing between healing and killing. You are choosing to be strong enough to do both when the situation requires it. She paused. My father was a soldier. He carried the same weight I carry. Before he died, he made me promise I would never pick up a rifle, that I would only heal. I broke that promise, and for years I thought that made me a failure, a disappointment. What changed? Santos asked quietly. Understanding, Sarah said, that keeping some promises requires breaking others. That my father's real wish was not that I keep my hands clean. It was that I survive, that I come home, that I be strong enough to carry the burden and still choose to save lives. She looked around at the 40 young faces, some scared, some eager, all of them about to learn that war was nothing like what they imagined. You are going to deploy, Sarah said. Some of you to combat zones. Some of you will treat wounded soldiers under fire. Some of you will save lives that seem impossible to save. And some of you will face the choice I faced, to pick up a rifle when you swore to only heal. She let that settle. When that moment comes, do not think about glory or medals or what people will say. Think about the soldiers who depend on you. Think about their families waiting for them to come home. Think about whether you can live with letting them die to keep your hands clean. And if you choose to fight, if you choose to become a warrior to remain a healer, remember this, you are not a killer. You are a protector. The intent matters. The burden matters. The willingness to carry that burden instead of passing it to someone else matters. The class was silent. Sarah could see it in their eyes, the first real understanding that they were training for something that would change them fundamentally and forever. She walked to the wall, touched the Medal of Honor case, then touched the photograph of Rashid. This medal honors one day of my life, Sarah said, but this photograph reminds me of every day after, of the weight I carry, of the man whose death I am responsible for, of the complexity that no medal can capture. She turned back to face the class. When you graduate from this course, you will be combat medics, healers, lifesavers. But if war demands it, you will also be warriors, protectors, and yes, killers. That duality is the burden. That is the price. She pulled out the small box from her pocket. Inside were her father's dog tags, worn smooth by years of handling. She held them up. My father carried these through 3 deployments, carried the weight of choices that cost him sleep and peace, and eventually his health. He died believing I would have an easier path, that I would avoid the burden he carried. Sarah closed her fist around the tags. He was wrong. The burden found me anyway. And when it did, I had to choose. Clean hands or living soldiers, clear conscience or mission success. The person I promised to be or the person my people needed me to become. Santos asked the question Sarah had been waiting for. What did you choose, ma'am? I chose both, Sarah said. I chose to be a healer who could fight, a warrior who could save. I chose to carry the weight of Rashid Ahmadi's death so that Kyle Mitchell could live. I chose complexity over simplicity, burden over innocence. And I chose to spend the rest of my life trying to make that choice mean something. The class sat in absolute silence, 40 young medics beginning to understand what they had volunteered for. Class dismissed, Sarah said quietly. They filed out slowly, most lost in thought. But Santos lingered behind, approached the wall where Rashid's photograph hung. Ma'am, Santos asked, why do you keep his picture there? Why remind yourself every day? Because forgetting would be easier, Sarah said. And I do not deserve easier. I deserve to remember, to carry the weight, to make sure his death and all the others have meaning, because I use the time they gave me to save as many lives as I can. Santos nodded slowly, then hesitantly. Ma'am, I am scared I will not be strong enough. If that moment comes. Sarah looked at this young soldier. This person at the beginning of a journey Sarah knew too well. Fear means you understand the weight, Sarah said gently. The soldiers I worry about are the ones who are not scared, who think killing is easy. You are scared because you know it will cost you something. That is good. That is human. Hold on to that. Will the fear ever go away? Santos asked. No, Sarah said honestly, but you will get strong enough to carry it. That is what we do. We carry what must be carried so others do not have to." Santos saluted and left. Sarah stood alone in the classroom with the Medal of Honor and the photograph and the weight that had become as much a part of her as breathing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Harper. He had retired from the Army, but stayed involved as a civilian instructor, teaching military history at a university, using his experience to help the next generation understand the cost of war. The text read, "How did the first day go?" Sarah typed back, "Told them about Rashid, about the lists, about the weight." Harper's reply came quickly. "Your father would be proud. You are teaching them what he learned too late, that the burden is real but bearable, that being both healer and warrior is not contradiction, but necessity." Sarah looked at the photograph on the wall, then at her reflection in the glass case holding the Medal of Honor. Two versions of herself, the woman she had been and the woman she had become. Both real, both necessary. She typed a final message to Harper. "Do you still read your list?" His response, "Every year. The weight does not get lighter, but we get stronger. That is enough." Sarah pocketed her phone and walked to the window. Outside, 40 young medics were drilling, learning to treat wounds, learning to save lives, not yet understanding that they might also learn to take them. But they would understand. War would teach them, and when it did, Sarah would be there to help them carry the weight, to show them that being both healer and warrior was possible, difficult, costly, but possible. She touched her father's dog tags through her uniform, felt their familiar weight. "You were right, Dad," she said quietly to the memory that haunted her gently now. "War did change me, made me into something I did not want to be, but it also made me into something I needed to be, and I am finally learning to be both." The sun was setting over Fort Jackson, turning the parade ground gold and red and purple, beautiful in the way that endings often were. Sarah watched the young medics drill and thought about beginnings and endings in the long middle where most of life happened. She thought about Khalid surviving and Rashid dying and the impossible mathematics of war that never added up cleanly. She thought about the taken and the saved and the list she would read every year until memory failed or death came, whichever arrived first. She thought about her father and Harper and all the soldiers who had carried this weight before her and all the ones who would carry it after. And she thought about tomorrow, about the next class of medics she would train, about the next generation she would prepare for the burden they did not yet understand. The weight was real, the burden was heavy, but Sarah Bennett was strong enough to carry it. She had proven that in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the halls of Walter Reed, in the quiet moments reading lists of names that would never fade, and she would prove it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the rest of her life, because that was the price, and that was the honor. And that was the legacy of being strong enough to be both healer and warrior in a world that desperately needed both. Sarah Bennett turned from the window and walked toward tomorrow, carrying the past in her heart and the future in her hands, both lists memorized, both truths acknowledged, both parts of herself finally, painfully, necessarily whole. The medal on the wall would gather dust. The photograph beside it would fade with time, but the weight would remain, and she would carry it, because someone had to. And she had proven she was strong enough. That would have to be enough. It was all any of them had. And sometimes what you have is exactly what you need to survive. After researching dozens of Medal of Honor citations, Sarah Bennett's story hit me the hardest. Not because of the firefight or the medal, but because of what she lost to save her squad. That 47 minutes in Kunar province cost her the promise she made to her dying father. She kept everyone alive, but at what price? I keep thinking about the two lists she maintains, the taken and the saved. How does a person carry that weight for a lifetime? What would you have done in her position? Keep the promise and let your squad die, or become what you swore you'd never be? Drop your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, there's more where this came from. Hit that subscribe button. These soldiers' stories deserve to be told. Next week, the sniper who saved 40 lives with one impossible shot.